What if I told you that one US president wrestled over 300 matches and only lost once? Another banned dancing in the White House, and one even had his wife secretly run the country for him? Yep, behind the suits, speeches, and history books, America's presidents have a wild side history rarely talks about. Forget everything you thought you knew about US presidents. This isn't your average history lesson. We're diving deep into the unknown, the crazy, and the downright bizarre facts about every US commander-in-chief, from George Washington to Joe Biden. These are the strange stories, secret talents, odd habits, and quirky scandals that reveal the human and sometimes hilarious side of the most powerful men in the world. Whether you're a history buff, a trivia nerd, or just someone who loves a good jaw-dropping fact, this one's for you. So grab your popcorn, sit back, and get ready, because once you hear these facts, you'll never look at a president the same way again. Let's begin. George Washington, the myth of the wooden teeth. When you think of George Washington, you probably picture a stern-faced guy on the dollar bill wearing a powdered wig, maybe crossing the Delaware, and of course, sporting those famous wooden teeth, right? Well, here's the thing. That's a myth. A persistent one, but still, totally false. George Washington never had wooden teeth. Not once. Not ever. But the truth? Honestly, it's way weirder than the myth. Let's back up a bit. Washington had notoriously bad dental health. By the time he took office in 1789, he had only one natural tooth left in his entire mouth. His dental problems weren't just annoying. They were painful, humiliating, and even impacted how he spoke in public. Historians believe his tight-lipped expressions in portraits weren't just for formality. It was because he was literally trying to hide his teeth. So, what were his dentures made of if not wood? Brace yourself. His false teeth were crafted from a mix of materials: human teeth, cow teeth, horse teeth, ivory, and even lead. And yes, you heard that right, human teeth. At the time, it was common to buy teeth from the poor, or, more disturbingly, from enslaved people. Documents even show Washington paid for teeth from his own slaves to be used in his dental work. That part of the story is darker, but incredibly important to acknowledge. Now, how did we get the wooden teeth rumor? Most likely the ivory dentures stained over time, turning brown and taking on a wood-like appearance. Combine that with generations of school books simplifying history, and boom, you've got the birth of a myth. But here's another fun twist. Washington actually had multiple sets of dentures, and they were all uncomfortable. Some were so poorly fitted, they distorted the shape of his face. His letters complain often about tooth pain, and his dentures had metal springs to help him chew, which meant he had to literally clench his mouth shut to keep them in. Imagine being president, fighting wars, and giving major addresses, while your fake teeth are threatening to spring open at any moment. Kind of makes your worst Zoom meeting look like a breeze. So, no, George Washington didn't have wooden teeth. But the real story, it's way more fascinating, slightly unsettling, and a reminder that even the father of our country was very, very human, and that's just the beginning. Because if you think this is strange, wait until you hear what the next president did every single morning in the nude. Stick around. John Adams, the White House move-in no one talks about. Today, the White House is one of the most recognizable homes in the world. Tourists flock to it, movies blow it up for fun, and every president since has called it home, whether they loved it or not. But here's the untold story about the very first guy to ever move in. John Adams hated the place. Let's rewind to the year 1800. The U.S. Capitol had just moved from Philadelphia to the swampy, unfinished city of Washington, D.C. And at the center of this new Capitol was a giant white mansion, not quite done, surrounded by muddy fields, and honestly, a total construction zone. John Adams was in the final year of his presidency when he and his wife, Abigail, packed their bags and made the move. He walked into what was supposed to be the most powerful residence in the country and was greeted by bare walls, cold hallways, no running water, no plumbing, and barely any furniture. There was no landscaping, no finished roads, and definitely no room service. It wasn't the people's house. It was the builder's headache. In fact, the second floor where the presidential family was supposed to live, had no heating system, and it was already fall when Adams moved in. Abigail had to hang laundry in the East Room because the house was so drafty and unlivable that she couldn't find a better place. And you want to talk about loneliness? The federal government was still moving down from Philly, so DC was practically empty. No nightlife, no parties, just a cold, echoing house with more scaffolding than staff. Adams didn't complain publicly. He was too dignified for that, but he did write a letter to his wife that included one of the most heartfelt quotes ever about the White House. He said, "I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it." That line is now carved into the fireplace in the state dining room. Even though Adams hated the living conditions, he believed in what the house symbolized. And that's kind of beautiful. But still, he only stayed for about 4 months. And when Thomas Jefferson won the election, Adams quietly left D.C. at 4 a.m. on March 4th, 1801. So quietly, in fact, that he didn't even stay to attend Jefferson's inauguration, a silent exit from a house he never really got to love. So, yeah, John Adams was technically the first president to live in the White House, but it's safe to say he didn't enjoy the rent. And speaking of unique presidential quirks, our next guy, he drafted the Declaration of Independence while spinning around in a homemade invention. Any guesses? Let's talk about Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, the founding father who spun his way into history. Okay, picture this. It's 1776. The air is thick with revolution. The founding fathers are holed up in Philadelphia, hammering out what would become the most iconic breakup letter in world history, the Declaration of Independence. And right in the middle of it all, Thomas Jefferson, casually spinning around in a chair. Not just any chair, mind you. A chair he invented. That's right. In addition to being a statesman, philosopher, writer, and architect, Thomas Jefferson was also a low-key inventor. And one of his most lasting creations? The swivel chair. The very thing your office probably can't live without today. Now, Jefferson didn't create the entire chair from scratch. But what he did do was modify a regular Windsor chair by installing an iron spindle between the seat and the legs, allowing the top to rotate. Think of it like a colonial version of your favorite desk chair. No wheels, just revolutionary swagger. According to historical records, Jefferson brought this chair with him to the Second Continental Congress. And yes, he may have written the first draft of the Declaration of Independence while spinning in it, which kind of makes him the founding father of both democracy and multitasking. Imagine it, Jefferson, feather quill in hand, inking the immortal words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," while absent-mindedly swiveling back and forth like a bored student during Zoom class. There's no hard proof he spun around while writing, but come on, you would too. Now, Jefferson didn't stop there. He was obsessed with functionality and design. He later made further modifications to his chair and added a writing arm. It eventually made its way to his estate at Monticello, where he surrounded himself with even more self-designed furniture and gadgets, including a revolving bookstand, a copying machine, and even a dumbwaiter for wine. Oh, and the original swivel chair? It still exists. You can find it today at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. Preserved like the national treasure it is. This little-known fact tells you a lot about Jefferson. He wasn't just a writer of big ideas. He liked building things that made everyday life more efficient, kind of like the original tech guy in a powdered wig. So next time you spin around in your chair during a meeting or lecture, remember, you're not just goofing off, you're channeling the spirit of a founding father. And speaking of quirky, our next president was basically the opposite of Jefferson in one key way. He was the smallest president in U.S. history, both in height and in weight, but not in impact. Let's talk about James Madison, the pocket-sized powerhouse who helped shape the Constitution. James Madison, the smallest president with the biggest legacy. All right, here's a fun trivia bomb to drop at your next dinner party. Who was the smallest president in U.S. history? Nope, not a trick question. It was James Madison, the fourth president of the United States, and the man widely known as the father of the Constitution. Madison stood at just 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed less than 100 pounds. That's shorter than most modern teenagers and lighter than some golden retrievers. If you stood him next to Abraham Lincoln, who was a towering 6 feet 4 inches tall, you'd probably think Madison was Lincoln's little brother, or maybe even his son. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite his tiny frame, Madison's political influence was absolutely massive. This guy helped shape the foundational documents of the United States, not just the Constitution, but also the Bill of Rights. He had a mind like a steel trap, and his intellectual firepower made him one of the most influential political thinkers in American history. And he had to be sharp, because physically, he was no warrior. During the Revolutionary War, Madison tried to join the Continental Army, but was rejected due to his size and chronic poor health. Instead of fighting on the battlefield, he fought with ideas, writing, debating, and drafting the very framework of the new nation. Now, his personality? Surprisingly bold. Madison may have looked like someone who'd get picked last for dodgeball, but he didn't shy away from conflict. He was a fierce debater, and he helped write the Federalist Papers alongside Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, those now famous essays that convinced the states to ratify the Constitution. And let's talk love life for a second. Madison married Dolly Payne Todd, who became one of the most beloved first ladies in American history. She was tall, outgoing, stylish, and brought serious energy to the White House. Basically, the social butterfly to Madison's soft-spoken bookworm vibe. Some historians say Dolly made Madison more likable to the public and played a huge role in boosting his political image. Talk about a power couple. Oh, and here's a bonus fact. During the War of 1812, Madison became the first and only sitting president to come under enemy fire as British forces burned Washington, D.C. Instead of panicking, he stayed with the troops. Imagine the tiniest president staring down one of the most powerful empires in the world. Ballsy move. So, while James Madison may have been physically small, his ideas, his legacy, and his courage were absolutely enormous. Coming up next, a president who literally carried a bullet in his body for most of his life, and not as a metaphor. Let's meet James Monroe, the man with a musket ball for a souvenir. James Monroe, the president who took a bullet and kept going. James Monroe is one of those presidents you kind of remember from your high school history class, mostly for the Monroe Doctrine, which basically told Europe to stay out of the Americas. But before he was laying down foreign policy, Monroe was out there literally taking bullets for the country. No, seriously. He took a musket ball to the shoulder during the Revolutionary War, and he carried it in his body for the rest of his life. Let's rewind to the year 1776. Monroe was just 18 years old, a college dropout turned soldier. He joined the Continental Army and quickly found himself in the thick of it, fighting at the Battle of Trenton, one of the most daring and pivotal moments in the entire war. That's the same battle where George Washington famously crossed the icy Delaware River for a surprise attack on the Hessian forces. It was bold, it was risky, and it worked. But for young Lieutenant Monroe, it almost cost him everything. During the battle, Monroe was leading a charge when he was shot in the left shoulder by a musket ball. The wound was severe. He nearly bled out on the field, and it was only thanks to a quick-thinking volunteer army surgeon who clamped his artery with his bare hands that Monroe survived. Doctors managed to patch him up, but they never removed the bullet. It stayed lodged in his body for decades. A permanent, painful souvenir from America's birth. Now here's the kicker. Monroe didn't just survive. He kept fighting. He stayed in the military, became an officer, then transitioned into politics. He served as a senator, a diplomat, Secretary of State, Secretary of War, and eventually became the 5th president of the United States, all with a literal bullet in his shoulder. Imagine sitting through endless meetings, writing policy, shaking hands, giving speeches, while still feeling the sting of a musket ball that nearly killed you 40 years earlier. That's not just dedication, that's hardcore. And Monroe wasn't one to brag about it either. In fact, most people didn't even know he carried the bullet. He saw it as part of his duty, part of the sacrifice. The man wasn't in it for glory, he just wanted to serve. He died in 1831 on July 4th. Yep, another president who died on Independence Day, joining the strange club with Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Talk about poetic timing. So yeah, James Monroe wasn't flashy, but he was a literal bulletproof patriot who bled for the revolution and never once backed down. And speaking of unexpected presidential surprises, our next guy, he liked to swim completely naked in public every morning. No shame, no swimsuit, just one with nature. Let's dive into John Quincy Adams in all his natural glory. John Quincy Adams, The naked truth about America's early riser. So far, we've met presidents with fake teeth, spinning chairs, and literal bullets lodged in their bodies. But how about a guy who started each day by getting naked and jumping into a river? Yep, meet John Quincy Adams, America's 6th president, and perhaps its most committed skinny dipper. John Quincy Adams had a morning routine unlike any other president before or since. Almost every day during his presidency, he would rise at dawn, leave the White House on foot, walk down to the Potomac River, and, wait for it, swim completely naked. No guards, no privacy, no trunks. Just the leader of the free world and the flowing waters of Washington, D.C. This wasn't a one-time thing. It was a habit. Adams believed in cold water therapy and the importance of early rising for mental clarity and physical health. So, long before the concept of self-care morning routines went viral, he was out there taking icy naked plunges before breakfast. Now, this fact would be strange enough on its own, but it gets even better. There's a legendary story involving a journalist named Anne Royal, one of America's first female reporters. At the time, she had been trying to secure an interview with the president, but kept getting denied. So, one morning she followed Adams down to the river and waited until he was already swimming. Then, she sat on his clothes. That's right. She literally plopped down on his clothes by the riverbank and refused to give them back until he agreed to answer her questions. Trapped in the water with no way to get modestly dressed, Adams finally gave in, and just like that, she scored the first ever presidential interview by a female journalist, while the president was treading water in the nude. Now, some historians debate the details of that story. Was it exaggerated over time? Maybe. But one thing that's well documented is that Adams really did skinny dip, and he really was a firm believer in early morning swims, no matter the season. To modern ears, it sounds wild, but to Adams, it was discipline. He was a deeply intelligent and eccentric man, fluent in multiple languages, obsessed with astronomy, and even kept a diary his entire life with over 15,000 entries. He wrote about politics, religion, science, and yes, even his swimming. So, while John Quincy Adams may not be the most well-known president, he holds the title for one of the most unusual routines ever to come out of the Oval Office. And coming up next, a president with a hot temper, a dueling past, and the wildest assassination story you've never heard. Because when someone tried to kill him, he didn't run. He beat the guy with his cane. Get ready for Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, the president who fought off an assassin with his cane. When it comes to tough presidents, Andrew Jackson's in a category all his own. This man was practically made of iron and pure spite. He survived smallpox, duels, and wars, and he didn't just walk into history. He stomped in, fists clenched, and ready to throw down. So, when someone tried to assassinate him, let's just say they picked the wrong guy. It was January 30th, 1835, a damp winter day in Washington, D.C. Jackson, then 67 years old, was attending the funeral of a congressman at the U.S. Capitol. As he was walking through the rotunda, a man named Richard Lawrence stepped out from the crowd, raised a pistol, and aimed it right at the president's chest. Boom! The gun misfired. Jackson froze. A second passed. Then, unbelievably, Lawrence pulled out a second pistol, took aim again, and boom! That one misfired too. 2 pistols, point-blank range, and both failed. Now let's pause here. Most people would drop to the ground, run for cover, call security, something. Not Jackson. The man charged his attacker and beat him senseless with his cane. Not once. Not twice. Witnesses say Jackson went into full rage mode, striking Lawrence over and over while shouting at him, until bystanders, including Davy Crockett, yes, the Davy Crockett, pulled the president off the would-be assassin. And here's where it gets even crazier. Both of Lawrence's pistols were later tested and found to be in perfect working order. Experts say the chance of both guns misfiring was about 1 in 125,000. Jackson himself believed it was divine intervention. But, divine or not, this moment cemented his image as one tough-as-nails leader. This wasn't his first brush with death either. Jackson famously fought in multiple duels, and in one case, he let his opponent shoot him in the chest just so he could take careful aim and shoot back more accurately. He carried that bullet in his chest for the rest of his life, along with another one in his arm from a separate duel. So, by the time he became president, Jackson was more metal than man. Of course, he wasn't without controversy. Jackson's presidency was marked by hard policies and even harder opinions, especially around the Indian Removal Act. But when it came to personal grit, Jackson basically redefined what it meant to be a tough president. So to recap, someone tried to kill the president twice, and the president responded by beating him with a cane. You just don't see that kind of energy at press conferences anymore. And speaking of presidents with firsts, our next commander-in-chief holds a different record. The first U.S. president born as an American citizen. Let's meet Martin Van Buren, also known as Old Kinderhook. And yes, that nickname may be the reason we say OK today. Martin Van Buren, the original American-born president and the man behind OK. Martin Van Buren may not be the flashiest name in presidential history, but he's got two claims to fame that make him stand out. First, he was the first U.S. president born as an American citizen. And second, believe it or not, he may be the reason we say the word OK today. Let's unpack that. Born in 1782 in Kinderhook, New York, Van Buren was the first president not born under British rule. Every president before him was technically a British subject at birth because the U.S. didn't officially exist until 1776. Van Buren arrived just in time to be part of the first true American generation. That's cool enough on its own, but what really gives Van Buren his quirky edge is his connection to one of the most commonly used phrases in the English language. Okay. Yep. Okay. As in, are you okay? That's okay. Or, okay, let's go. We use it all day, every day. But where did it come from? Enter Old Kinderhook. During Van Buren's 1840 re-election campaign, his supporters leaned hard into his hometown roots. They called him Old Kinderhook, a nod to his birthplace in Kinderhook, New York, and started a slogan that said, "Vote for OK." It caught on like wildfire. OK clubs popped up all over the country, rallying voters with catchy slogans and buttons. The phrase started making its way into everyday language, where OK began to take on its modern meaning as something agreeable or satisfactory. Now here's the twist. Linguists will tell you that OK actually had multiple weird origins around that time. One theory says it came from a joking misspelling of all correct as all correct, because 19th century newspapers loved absurd abbreviations. But the Old Kinderhook theory, it helped popularize the term and launch it into common speech. So even if Van Buren didn't invent the phrase, his campaign absolutely mainstreamed it. And let's be honest, if your legacy includes being tied to the word okay, that's kind of amazing. Now, politically speaking, Van Buren's time in office was not so okay. His presidency was rocked by the Panic of 1837, a major financial crisis that tanked the economy and his popularity. He ended up losing his re-election to William Henry Harrison in a landslide. But linguistically, he left a mark on American culture that we still say out loud every single day. So next time someone asks how you're doing and you reply, "I'm okay," just know there's a chance you're quoting Martin Van Buren's campaign slogan from 1840. Coming up next, a president who gave the longest inauguration speech in history refused to wear a coat and died a month later. You won't believe how fast this guy's presidency ended. Let's talk about William Henry Harrison, the man who caught a cold and lost the office before he could even find the bathroom. William Henry Harrison, the president who talked himself to death. Most people remember William Henry Harrison for one thing. He was president for only 31 days. But what gets way less attention is how he got there, and how he may have literally talked himself to death. Let's set the stage. It's March 4th, 1841. William Henry Harrison is being sworn in as the 9th president of the United States. At 68 years old, he was the oldest man ever elected president at the time. And this inauguration, it was a big deal. Harrison was a war hero, the Tippecanoe, from the campaign slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And people were expecting a show. And boy, did they get one. On that cold, wet, windy day in Washington, D.C., Harrison showed up without a coat, hat, or gloves. Why? Because he wanted to prove he was still strong, tough, and youthful despite his age. Big mistake. Then he stepped up to the podium and delivered the longest inaugural speech in U.S. history. 8,445 words, over 2 hours long. Imagine standing there in the freezing cold, coatless, giving the equivalent of a TED Talk on steroids, just to impress your audience. He went on and on about ancient Rome, philosophy, military history, you name it. By the end, even his most loyal supporters were probably like, "Sir, please go inside." But Harrison, he was all about appearances. He wanted to show the nation that he wasn't too old for the job. The problem was, he kind of was. Just a few weeks later, Harrison developed what seemed like a cold. It quickly turned into pneumonia. Some say it was from the long speech and the bitter wind. Others argue it may have come from the unsanitary conditions at the White House, which at the time was a breeding ground for all sorts of bacteria. Either way, his condition worsened fast. Doctors tried everything: bloodletting, opium, castor oil. Yes, seriously. But nothing worked. On April 4th, 1841, just 31 days after taking office, William Henry Harrison died. He holds the record for the shortest presidency in American history. He barely had time to move his things into the White House, let alone run the country. The lesson? Never underestimate the importance of layering up in cold weather and keeping your speeches short. But Harrison's death also triggered something major. It was the first time a sitting president died in office, and no one really knew what to do. That led to Vice President John Tyler stepping in and essentially creating the modern system of presidential succession. So while Harrison didn't get much time to leave his mark, his exit changed the presidency forever. Next up, that very man, John Tyler, who had 15 children and somehow has grandsons who were still alive in the 21st century. Yes, really. Let's get into it. John Tyler, the president with 15 kids and 21st century grandsons. If you thought big families were just a modern reality show trend, think again, because John Tyler, the 10th president of the United States, takes the crown for the most presidential kids ever. 15 children. Yes, 15. Tyler had 8 children with his first wife, Letitia, and after she passed away, he remarried Julia Gardner and had 7 more, making him not only the most prolific president in terms of family size, but also the first president to get married while in office. But here's where things get absolutely mind-blowing. Thanks to Tyler having kids very late in life, and those kids also having children late in life, 2 of his grandsons were still alive well into the 21st century. Let that sink in. A man born in 1790, the same year George Washington was president, has grandchildren who were alive in your lifetime. How does that work? Let's do the math. Tyler had his 13th child, Lyon Gardner Tyler, in 1853, when John was 63 years old. Lyon then had a son, Lyon Gardner Tyler Jr., in 1924, when he himself was 71. That child, Tyler's grandson, lived all the way into 2020. And another grandson, Harrison Ruffin Tyler, was born in 1928 and was still alive as of the early 2020s. So yes, John Tyler's direct grandsons lived into the era of iPhones, TikTok, and Netflix. It's one of those time warp facts that messes with your brain. One man's life literally spanned 3 centuries through just 3 generations. Now, outside of his enormous family tree, John Tyler had a presidency that was, let's just say, complicated. He wasn't even elected president. He was William Henry Harrison's vice president and got pushed into the top job when Harrison died just 31 days into his term. You remember that from the last segment. And people were not thrilled. Congress called him his accidency because they didn't think he had a legitimate claim to the office. But Tyler didn't care. He refused to be treated like a placeholder, took control, and set the precedent for vice presidential succession that still stands today. So not only did he shape how we handle presidential transitions, but he also shaped a family tree so long it practically reaches into the future. And just to top it all off, after leaving office, Tyler sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War and even got elected to the Confederate Congress. Because why stop being controversial when you've already made history, boys? So, yeah, John Tyler, father of 15, grandfather to men with Twitter accounts, pioneer of presidential succession, complicated legacy, undeniably unforgettable. Coming up next, a president who banned dancing and alcohol in the White House. Time to meet James K. Polk, the most workaholic and least party-friendly president you've probably never learned enough about. Fact number 11. James K. Polk, the president who banned fun in the White House. Let's talk about James K. Polk, the 11th president of the United States, and quite possibly the most serious, no-nonsense workaholic ever to set foot in the Oval Office. This guy didn't just take his job seriously. He basically treated the presidency like a full-time boot camp, and while most presidents hosted parties, balls, and banquets at the White House, Polk had a different vibe. He banned dancing and alcohol entirely. That's right. Under Polk's administration, the White House was a no-fun zone. His wife, Sarah Childress Polk, was equally devout and just as committed to maintaining a White House that reflected their deeply religious and morally strict values. Together, they turned the executive mansion into something more like a church than a social club. So, why the anti-dancing, anti-drinking stance? Well, Polk was a devout Methodist, and Methodists at the time frowned upon alcohol, card games, dancing, and any form of worldly indulgence. As president, he believed it was his duty to lead by example, even if it meant canceling the vibe at every formal gathering. Imagine being a foreign dignitary invited to the White House for a grand ball, only to be told there would be no music, no wine, and absolutely no dancing. Congratulations, you just entered the Polk zone. But what Polk lacked in party spirit, he made up for in productivity. The man was an absolute machine. In just one term, he managed to accomplish nearly everything on his presidential to-do list. That includes settling the Oregon boundary dispute with Britain, leading the U.S. through the Mexican-American War, acquiring California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, and establishing a national treasury system. Basically, he expanded the nation's borders to the Pacific and reshaped the map of America, all while sipping water and listening to silence. He worked so hard, in fact, that he wore himself out. Polk promised to serve only one term, and he kept that promise. But within just 3 months of leaving office, he died of exhaustion and illness at age 53. His was the shortest retirement of any U.S. president. So, while James K. Polk might not have been the guy you'd want to invite to a wedding or a karaoke night, he was one of the most focused and effective presidents the country has ever seen. And let's be honest, banning alcohol and dancing might sound harsh, but the guy literally redrew the country. That's one way to leave a legacy. Coming up next, a president who loved cherries and milk so much, it may have killed him. Let's talk about Zachary Taylor and the 4th of July snack that led to a presidential funeral. James K. Polk, the president who banned fun in the White House. Let's talk about James K. Polk, the 11th president of the United States, and quite possibly the most serious, no-nonsense workaholic ever to set foot in the Oval Office. This guy didn't just take his job seriously. He basically treated the presidency like a full-time boot camp. And while most presidents hosted parties, balls, and banquets at the White House, Polk had a different vibe. He banned dancing and alcohol entirely. That's right. Under Polk's administration, the White House was a no-fun zone. His wife, Sarah Childress Polk, was equally devout and just as committed to maintaining a White House that reflected their deeply religious and morally strict values. Together, they turned the executive mansion into something more like a church than a social club. So why the anti-dancing, anti-drinking stance? Well, Polk was a devout Methodist, and Methodists at the time frowned upon alcohol, card games, dancing, and any form of worldly indulgence. As president, he believed it was his duty to lead by example, even if it meant canceling the vibe at every formal gathering. Imagine being a foreign dignitary invited to the White House for a grand ball, only to be told there would be no music, no wine, and absolutely no dancing. Congratulations, you just entered the Polk zone. But what Polk lacked in party spirit, he made up for in productivity. The man was an absolute machine. In just one term, he managed to accomplish nearly everything on his presidential to-do list. That includes settling the Oregon boundary dispute with Britain, leading the U.S. through the Mexican-American War, acquiring California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, and establishing a national treasury system. Basically, he expanded the nation's borders to the Pacific and reshaped the map of America, all while sipping water and listening to silence. He worked so hard, in fact, that he wore himself out. Polk promised to serve only one term, and he kept that promise. but within just 3 months of leaving office, he died of exhaustion and illness at age 53. His was the shortest retirement of any U.S. president. So, while James K. Polk might not have been the guy you'd want to invite to a wedding or a karaoke night, he was one of the most focused and effective presidents the country has ever seen. And let's be honest, banning alcohol and dancing might sound harsh, but the guy literally redrew the country. That's one way to leave a legacy. Coming up next, a president who loved cherries and milk so much, it may have killed him. Let's talk about Zachary Taylor and the 4th of July snack that led to a presidential funeral. Zachary Taylor, the president who may have been killed by a bowl of cherries. Some presidential deaths are tragic, others are historic, but Zachary Taylor's death, it's kind of bizarre because this one might have come down to a bowl of cherries and a glass of milk. Let's rewind to July 4th, 1850. President Taylor, just 16 months into his term, was attending a long, hot Independence Day celebration at the Washington Monument. The sun was blazing, the speeches were endless, and after hours of patriotic pageantry, Taylor was starving. So, when he finally got a break, he downed what seemed like a refreshing summer snack: chilled milk, cold water, and a massive bowl of cherries. It was festive, it was seasonal, and 4 days later, he was dead. Doctors at the time called it cholera morbus, basically an old-fashioned term for severe food poisoning. He had violent stomach cramps, diarrhea, fever, and dehydration. On July 9th, 1850, Zachary Taylor died in the White House. He was 65 years old. Now, was it really the cherries and milk that did him in? That's been debated for years. Some historians believe the acidic cherries mixed with dairy may have upset his stomach in a major way. Remember, refrigeration wasn't exactly top tier in 1850. Others argue that the water may have been contaminated, which wasn't uncommon in DC at the time. But there's also a darker theory. In the 1990s, conspiracy theories began swirling that Taylor might have been poisoned. Why? Because he was strongly opposed to the expansion of slavery into new U.S. territories, an issue that was heating up the nation and making a lot of Southern leaders very nervous. Could someone have wanted him out of the way? To investigate, Taylor's remains were exhumed in 1991. Yes, over 140 years after his death, and tested for arsenic. The results? Only trace amounts, far too low to suggest foul play. So the official conclusion remained: bad food, bad timing. Either way, Taylor's death shocked the nation. He had been a popular general in the Mexican-American War, known as Old Rough and Ready for his tough, no-frills leadership. He wasn't a polished politician, he didn't even vote until he was 62, but people admired his plain-spoken honesty. Unfortunately, he didn't live long enough to leave a lasting political legacy. His sudden death elevated Millard Fillmore to the presidency and shifted the political balance during a critical moment in pre-Civil War America. So, yeah, Zachary Taylor may have led troops through war zones, commanded armies, and faced battlefield chaos. But in the end, it might have been a few cherries and a glass of milk that brought down the president. Coming up next, a president who literally married his former school teacher. Let's talk about Millard Fillmore, the man who took teacher's pet to a whole new level. Millard Fillmore, the president who married his teacher. Millard Fillmore is one of those presidents most people forget. He's not on any major currency, he didn't lead any wars, and let's be honest, his name sounds more like an accountant than a commander-in-chief. But here's a fact that might make you do a double take. He married his former teacher. Yes, you heard that right. The 13th president of the United States, who took office after Zachary Taylor's sudden death, literally tied the knot with the woman who once taught him in school. Let's rewind. Fillmore was born into extreme poverty in upstate New York in 1800. His family was so poor, he grew up wearing clothes made from flour sacks and barely had access to formal education. At 19 years old, he enrolled in a local one-room schoolhouse to get some basic learning in. And that's where he met Abigail Powers, a teacher just 2 years older than him, but already incredibly educated and well-read. Fillmore quickly became her most ambitious student, quiet, hardworking, and eager to climb his way out of poverty. Over time, their relationship shifted from academic to romantic, and after several years of courtship, they got married in 1826. Abigail didn't just become his wife, She became his partner in every way. She encouraged him to keep studying, supported his rise through law school, and helped him navigate the tricky waters of early American politics. In fact, many historians believe Abigail was the driving intellectual force behind Fillmore's ascent to national prominence. Fast forward to 1850, President Zachary Taylor dies unexpectedly, and Fillmore, his vice president, suddenly becomes the 13th president of the United States. Abigail, now First Lady, made her mark immediately. She insisted on creating the first official White House library, believing that the executive mansion should be a place of knowledge and learning. It was her way of honoring the power of education, the very thing that brought her and her husband together. But sadly, her time in the White House was brief. Abigail fell ill shortly after Fillmore left office and died in 1853, just 26 days after witnessing Franklin Pierce's inauguration in freezing cold weather. It's a love story that's rarely talked about. From teacher and student to First Lady and President, Millard and Abigail Fillmore shared a bond built on learning, support, and ambition. While Fillmore's presidency is mostly remembered for signing the Compromise of 1850, which delayed the Civil War by only a few years, his personal story is something else entirely. A reminder that no matter how humble your beginnings, with the right guidance and a little heart, you can reach the top. Next up, a president who once ran over a woman with his horse and got arrested for it. Let's dive into the strange tale of Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce, the president who got arrested for running over a woman. Franklin Pierce might be one of the least talked about presidents, but that doesn't mean his life was uneventful. In fact, this guy had a scandal that would have made headlines everywhere if cable news had existed in the 1850s. Because yes, a sitting U.S. president was once arrested. The charge? Running over an old woman with his horse. Let's rewind to 1853. Pierce had just become the 14th president of the United States, riding in on a wave of political compromise and personal tragedy. He was handsome, charming, and often called the most elegant man to ever occupy the White House, but he had a complicated relationship with alcohol and an even worse relationship with public perception. Now here's where it gets strange. While riding his horse through the streets of Washington, D.C., Pierce allegedly lost control and ran over an elderly woman. There were conflicting reports. Some claimed it was an accident. Others whispered he may have been drinking. Either way, the incident led to a full-on arrest while he was still in office. Yes, a U.S. president in handcuffs. It's believed he didn't spend any real time in jail. The case was quickly dropped due to lack of evidence, or, as some speculate, political pressure to sweep the scandal under the rug. Either way, no charges stuck, but the story followed Pierce for the rest of his presidency. And honestly, it wasn't even the darkest thing to happen to him that year. Just a few months earlier, in one of the most tragic events in presidential history, Pierce and his wife were traveling by train when it derailed. Their 11-year-old son, Benjamin, was killed before their eyes, his body crushed in the wreck. It was their only surviving child. The trauma left both Pierces emotionally shattered. Franklin was said to be deeply depressed, and his wife, Jane, became a virtual recluse, draping the White House in mourning and avoiding public appearances. She blamed politics for her son's death. So you've got a president grieving a horrific loss, possibly drinking, trying to hold the country together, and then accidentally running someone over with a horse. It paints a picture of a man completely out of his depth, emotionally and politically. As president, Pierce's biggest controversy was signing the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which inflamed tensions over slavery and pushed the country even closer to civil war. His popularity tanked, and even his own party refused to renominate him for a second term. His presidency is often ranked among the worst, but his story? Complex, tragic, and a bit shocking. Next up, a lifelong bachelor, a White House roommate, and rumors that never stop swirling. Let's talk about James Buchanan, possibly America's first gay president. James Buchanan, America's bachelor president, and possibly its first gay one. James Buchanan is often remembered as the only U.S. president who never married, but there's much more to his story than just a missing first lady. In fact, Buchanan's lifelong bachelorhood, combined with a very close relationship with another prominent male politician, has led some historians to ask a fascinating question. Was James Buchanan America's first gay president? Let's break it down. Buchanan served as the 15th president right before the Civil War. A rough time to say the least. But before he got to the White House, he had a long career as a senator, secretary of state, and diplomat. During that time, he developed a very close relationship with William Rufus King, a fellow politician who would go on to serve briefly as vice president under Franklin Pierce. The two men were inseparable. They lived together in Washington, dined together daily, and were regularly seen attending social events as a pair. They even shared a boarding house for over a decade. Their relationship was so notable that Andrew Jackson, never one to mince words, once referred to King as Miss Nancy, and other politicians reportedly called them Mr. and Mrs. Buchanan behind their backs. Ouch. Now, let's be real. In the 1800s, it wasn't uncommon for unmarried men to live together, especially in political circles. But the level of emotional intimacy described in Buchanan's letters, combined with the fact that he never courted another woman after King's death, has fueled speculation for generations. In one letter after King had left for Europe, Buchanan wrote, "I am now solitary and alone, having no companion in the house with me. I have gone a-wooing to several gentlemen, but have not succeeded with any of them." It's a striking sentence, especially for a man known to be meticulous and reserved. But despite the rumors and historical curiosity, there's no concrete evidence that Buchanan was gay. Historians are cautious not to label someone retroactively without definitive proof. And of course, the concept of sexual orientation was very different in the 19th century. Still, Buchanan's story remains one of the most open questions in presidential history, and a reminder that even in the buttoned-up world of 1800s politics, there were always whispers, relationships, and complexities that history books don't always capture. As for his presidency, let's just say it didn't go great. Buchanan's inaction as Southern states began to secede is widely seen as one of the reasons the Civil War broke out. He handed Abraham Lincoln a nation already falling apart. But behind the politics lies a very human question. Was James Buchanan simply a man of his time, or a man forced to hide who he really was? Coming up next, a towering figure, a stovepipe hat, and the president who was, wait for it, a professional wrestler with a 299-1 record. Let's step into the ring with Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, the president who could wrestle you into next week. Before he freed the slaves, delivered the Gettysburg Address, and became a marble statue that tourists line up to see, Abraham Lincoln had another title under his belt, champion wrestler. Yep, Honest Abe didn't just wrestle with the nation's greatest moral crisis. He literally wrestled, and he was really good at it. As a young man growing up in Illinois, Lincoln was tall, lean, and surprisingly strong. Standing at 6 feet 4 inches, he towered over most men of his time. Combine that with years of hard labor on the frontier, and you had a guy who could toss hay bales and his opponents with ease. In his early 20s, Lincoln became locally famous for his wrestling skills. He competed in what's known as catch-as-catch can wrestling, a rough anything-goes style of grappling that was less Olympic and more tavern brawl. According to most historical accounts, Lincoln had over 300 matches and lost only one. You read that right. 299 wins, 1 loss. One of his most legendary bouts happened in 1831 when Lincoln was living in New Salem, Illinois. A local gang leader named Jack Armstrong challenged him to a match. The two squared off in a dirt clearing surrounded by a crowd, and Lincoln dominated. He didn't just win the match. He earned the respect of the town's toughest crew and solidified his rep as someone you absolutely did not want to mess with. Even decades later, that reputation stuck. His friends would joke that Abe could take on any 2 men in a fight and still walk away looking for a third. But Lincoln didn't let the wins go to his head. He was known for his sportsmanship, often shaking hands with opponents and offering a kind word even after throwing them into the ground. In fact, his wrestling prowess was so legendary that in 1992, over a century after his death, Abraham Lincoln was inducted into the National Wrestling Hall of Fame. Yes, that Wrestling Hall of Fame. He even has an official plaque recognizing his near-perfect record and his contribution to the sport. It's one of those fun contradictions about Lincoln. He's remembered as a thoughtful, soft-spoken intellectual, but he also had this rugged physical side that came from growing up in the wild backwoods of America. He could debate philosophy one minute and body slam a guy in the next. So the next time you see that statue of Lincoln sitting calmly in Washington, D.C., just remember, that man could have folded you like a lawn chair. Coming up next, a president who never went to school, taught himself to read and write, and rose all the way to the top with grit alone. Let's talk about Andrew Johnson, the tailor turned president. Andrew Johnson, the self-taught tailor who became president. Most presidents went to elite schools, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, but Andrew Johnson, he never spent a single day in a classroom. That's right, the 17th president of the United States was completely self-educated. He never learned to read or write as a child, and when he became president, he carried more needle and thread experience than academic degrees. Let's take it back. Johnson was born in 1808 in Raleigh, North Carolina, to a poor family. His father died when he was just 3 years old, and his mother, desperate to support her kids, apprenticed young Andrew to a tailor at age 10. That means while most children were learning their ABCs, Johnson was learning how to stitch sleeves. But he wasn't content to just sew coats. At night, after long days in the tailor shop, Johnson and his brother would listen to readings from customers who stopped in to recite newspapers and political speeches. Inspired by what he heard, Johnson began teaching himself to read, phonetically sounding out words letter by letter. Later, with the help of his wife, Eliza McCardle, who was a school teacher, Johnson also learned how to write and do basic math. She would read to him while he worked and correct his grammar. Their humble home in Tennessee essentially became his schoolhouse. Fast forward a few years, and the once illiterate boy was giving impassioned speeches and rising through local politics. He became mayor, then state legislator, then governor, and eventually U.S. senator. And then came one of the strangest political plot twists in U.S. history. In 1864, during the height of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln chose Johnson, a Southern Democrat who remained loyal to the Union, as his running mate. The idea was to unify the fractured nation by showing bipartisanship. And then just weeks into their second term, Lincoln was assassinated and Johnson became the 17th president. It was one of the most critical moments in American history. The country was broken, slavery had just been abolished, and the future was uncertain. But Johnson, he struggled. While he had pulled himself up from nothing, truly the American dream, he clashed hard with Congress over Reconstruction. He vetoed civil rights legislation, refused to guarantee protections for newly freed slaves, and was ultimately impeached by the House of Representatives, the first U.S. president ever to face impeachment. He narrowly avoided removal from office by just one vote in the Senate. So, Andrew Johnson's legacy is complicated, but his journey, unbelievable. From illiterate apprentice to the highest office in the land, with zero formal education. It's a story of grit, determination, and maybe a little too much stubbornness. Next up, a president who got arrested for speeding on a horse. Let's ride into the wildlife of Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant, the president who got arrested for speeding on a horse. You've heard of speeding tickets. You've probably even gotten one. But how about getting arrested for speeding on a horse while serving as president of the United States? Yep, that actually happened. And the man behind the reins, Ulysses S. Grant, Civil War hero, 18th president, and apparently a bit of a speed demon on four hooves. Let's set the scene. It's 1872, and Grant is president, living in Washington, D.C. The streets aren't filled with cars yet. They're packed with horses, carriages, and pedestrians. Grant, being an accomplished rider with a lifelong love of horses, often traveled the city on horseback. The problem was, he liked to ride fast. One day, he was spotted galloping at full speed through the streets, startling pedestrians and violating the city's speed limit for horses. A local black police officer named William H. West, yes, a former Union Army soldier himself, stopped the president and gave him a stern warning. To his credit, Grant apologized, promised to be more careful, and rode off. But here's the twist. The very next day, Officer West saw Grant speeding again, this time even faster. So, what did he do? He did what he'd do for anyone else breaking the law. He arrested the President of the United States. Grant was reportedly very polite, even impressed by the officer's commitment to the law. Instead of pulling rank or demanding special treatment, he went quietly to the police station, paid a $20 bond, and even expressed that he understood the importance of setting an example. Now imagine that happening today, a sitting president being handcuffed and taken to the station for a traffic violation. It's unthinkable. But in that moment, Grant showed a surprising level of humility and respect for the rule of law. This wasn't just a quirky headline. It became a legendary story in DC lore. Officer West was later praised for his courage and integrity, and the incident was cited as a shining example of equality under the law, even when the lawbreaker was the commander-in-chief, and it fits with Grant's character. He was a man of honor and discipline, shaped by war, but never above a lesson in accountability. Despite scandals in his administration, Grant himself was known for being personally honest and deeply respectful of public service. Also worth noting, Grant loved horses that much. He was an expert rider, could break wild stallions, and even once said that horses were his true passion. So it's no surprise he occasionally got carried away in the saddle. But when it came to responsibility, he took the reins. Next up, a president whose first lady banned alcohol in the White House, earning her the nickname Lemonade Lucy. Let's pour one out, non-alcoholic of course, for Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes, the dry White House, and Lemonade Lucy. When you think of the White House, you might imagine formal dinners, clinking wine glasses, and presidential toasts under glittering chandeliers. But during the presidency of Rutherford B. Hayes, the only thing you'd be toasting with was lemonade. Why? Because of one woman, Lucy Webb Hayes, the first lady who banned alcohol from the White House and earned herself the nickname Lemonade Lucy. Let's set the stage. Hayes became the 19th president in 1877, following one of the most disputed elections in U.S. history. He needed every ounce of public support he could get, and his wife Lucy was the perfect political partner, graceful, educated, and deeply religious. Lucy was a lifelong teetotaler, meaning she didn't drink alcohol and believed strongly in the temperance movement. For her, banning booze wasn't just about personal preference. It was a moral stand. When her husband became president, Lucy refused to serve alcohol at official functions, and Hayes backed her completely. In fact, he once wrote in his diary, "I do not think that I am more temperate than many others, but I do believe that public men should avoid giving countenance to intemperance." Translation: if we're going to preach moderation, we need to practice it, especially in the people's house. As a result, all White House events during the Hayes administration were dry. No champagne, no wine, no cocktails. Instead, guests were offered water, lemonade, and coffee. Lots of coffee. Now here's where the nickname comes in. Washington society, known for its lavish balls and banquets, wasn't exactly thrilled about the sudden lack of libations. Jokingly, with a touch of snark, they began referring to the First Lady as Lemonade Lucy, but the name stuck. And honestly, Lucy didn't mind one bit. She embraced the nickname and continued her campaign for temperance throughout Hayes' term. But here's the twist. While Lucy gets all the credit, or blame, depending on your cocktail preferences, she actually didn't make the official decision to ban alcohol. That was Rutherford himself. He made the call for political reasons, to align with the growing prohibition movement and to appeal to key voter blocs in the South and Midwest. Still, Lucy became the face of the alcohol-free White House, and her legacy endures as one of the most influential first ladies of the 19th century. And Hayes, while his presidency may not be remembered for bold policy, his commitment to reform and clean governance, even if it meant trading Merlot for lemonade, left its mark. So, cheers to Lemonade Lucy and the dry days of the Hayes administration. Next up, a president who could write Greek with one hand and Latin with the other at the same time. Yes, you heard that right. Time to meet the brilliant and ambidextrous James A. Garfield. James A. Garfield, the two-handed, two-language president. When we think of U.S. presidents, we often picture military leaders, statesmen, and power brokers. But James A. Garfield was something else entirely, a full-blown intellectual powerhouse. He wasn't just smart, he was next-level genius. And here's the wildest proof. Garfield was ambidextrous and fluent in both Latin and Greek. Legend has it that he could write Greek with one hand and Latin with the other at the same time. Let that sink in for a second. Most people struggle to write legibly with their dominant hand. Garfield, he could simultaneously write in two ancient languages, each with one hand, moving in opposite directions. That's not just intelligence, that's brain gymnastic gold. Now, was it a party trick? Maybe. But it also speaks to just how gifted Garfield truly was. Born in 1831 in a log cabin in Ohio, Garfield grew up in poverty. His father died when he was young, and like many early presidents, he worked odd jobs, including being a canal boat driver. But he loved learning, and that love propelled him into a life of scholarship and public service. He studied at Williams College in Massachusetts, became a professor, and then president of Hiram College, all before his political career even began. He was one of the few presidents who truly earned the label of scholar. He could reportedly recite long passages of classical literature from memory, dabbled in calculus and philosophy, and had a photographic memory. Oh, and he also taught himself shorthand, just for fun. So, how did this brainiac become president? Garfield entered politics after serving as a general in the Union Army during the Civil War. He worked his way up through Congress and, in 1880, emerged as a dark horse candidate at the Republican National Convention. He hadn't even planned to run, but after 36 rounds of voting, the delegates chose him as a compromise nominee, and he won. But tragically, Garfield's presidency was cut short after just 4 months. In July 1881, he was shot by an angry office seeker named Charles Guiteau. Garfield didn't die right away. The bullet lodged near his spine, but medical treatment at the time was so poor, think unsanitized fingers digging around in wounds, that he eventually died of infection. He passed away in September 1881, serving just 199 days in office, one of the shortest presidencies in American history. So while James A. Garfield may not have had time to reshape the country, his sheer brilliance left a lasting impression. A genius general, a reluctant politician, and the only president in history who could probably write your college thesis with both hands before lunch. Coming up next, a president who had over 80 pairs of pants and changed outfits multiple times a day. Let's get stylish with Chester A. Arthur. Chester A. Arthur, the best-dressed president in U.S. history. Presidents are often remembered for what they did in office, landmark legislation, foreign policy, or crisis leadership. But Chester A. Arthur, the 21st president of the United States, he's remembered for something a little more fabulous. His wardrobe. That's right, Arthur wasn't just the leader of the country. He was the best-dressed man in Washington, a fashion icon in the age of top hats and tailcoats. He reportedly owned over 80 pairs of pants and wasn't shy about changing outfits multiple times a day. Imagine your closet. Now imagine a closet that needed its own room. Arthur was obsessed with looking sharp. Silk cravats, custom-tailored suits, imported gloves, you name it, he wore it. If there was a presidential runway, he would have walked it daily. He even had a valet dedicated solely to managing his wardrobe. But here's what's wild. Before he became president, Chester A. Arthur didn't exactly have a squeaky clean political record. He was seen as a classic machine politician, the kind of guy who owed his rise to political favors, not principle. He was appointed to cushy jobs thanks to connections with the powerful New York political boss Roscoe Conkling, and many people thought Arthur was just a flashy insider with no real backbone. So, when President James A. Garfield was assassinated in 1881 and Arthur took over, the country panicked. A lot of people thought he'd turned the White House into a tailor's showroom. Or worse, a puppet government for the political elite. But here's the twist. Arthur surprised everyone. He took the job seriously. He reformed the civil service, signed the Pendleton Act to reduce corruption, and showed an unexpected level of independence from his political allies. Yes, he still dressed like a GQ cover model. Yes, he still rocked those 80-plus pairs of pants. But he also governed with dignity and worked hard to clean up the very system that had once benefited him. And let's not forget, he had style with purpose. When he moved into the White House, he thought it looked outdated and, his words, dingy. So he hired Louis Comfort Tiffany, yes, of Tiffany and Company fame, to redesign the interior with colored glass, lavish lighting, and upscale flair. Arthur was the only president to give the White House a Tiffany makeover. He even had historical relics and furniture from earlier presidencies auctioned off to make room for his sleek new aesthetic. So, yeah, Chester A. Arthur might not have been a wartime president or a household name, but he taught America that you can be stylish, underestimated, and still make real change. Coming up next, a president who wasn't just tough on crime. He actually personally hanged 2 men while serving as a sheriff. Let's get a little dark with Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland, the president who pulled the gallows lever himself before he was president, twice by the way. Grover Cleveland had a job that most modern politicians wouldn't dare talk about on the campaign trail. He was a sheriff in Buffalo, New York, and as sheriff, he was responsible for carrying out executions. But here's where things get jaw-dropping. Grover Cleveland personally hanged 2 men with his own hands. No delegation, no last-minute call to delay it. He literally pulled the lever that dropped the trap door. Let's rewind to the early 1870s. Cleveland was serving as the sheriff of Erie County, a job that came with some serious responsibilities, one of which was overseeing executions by hanging. Now, most sheriffs at the time hired someone else to do the actual deed. It was common to pay a professional hangman or appoint a deputy, but not Cleveland. He reportedly said that if the duty fell to him, he wouldn't pass it off. He believed in taking full responsibility, even for something as grim as execution. So when the time came to carry out capital punishment, Cleveland refused to hide behind bureaucracy. The first case was a man named Patrick Morrissey, convicted of murdering his mother. The second was John Gaffney, found guilty of a brutal stabbing. In both cases, Cleveland stood at the gallows, flipped the lever, and watched as justice, however harsh, was carried out. And this wasn't kept secret. Locals knew about it, and the stories followed him as he moved up in politics. When he later ran for governor of New York and eventually president, opponents tried to use the executions against him, labeling him cold and unfeeling. But to his supporters, it was the opposite. They saw a man who stood by his principles, someone who didn't shy away from tough decisions, even when they were heavy, personal, and haunting. It fit with Cleveland's whole persona: stoic, dutiful, and morally uncompromising. And while we're on the topic of firsts and records, Cleveland is also the only U.S. president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. He was the 22nd president and the 24th president, making him the only person to be counted twice in the official list. But long before he was breaking presidential records, he was a man standing on a wooden platform, fulfilling a grim responsibility that most would run from. It's a side of presidential history that feels more like a gritty Western than a DC biography. But it's real, it's raw, and it's Grover Cleveland. Coming up next, the grandson of another president who brought electricity to the White House and was so scared of it, he refused to touch the light switches. Let's illuminate the story of Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison, the president who feared the light switch. When we think of presidents embracing technology, we imagine grand unveilings, futuristic visions, and viral tweets. But Benjamin Harrison, the 23rd president of the United States, he was a little more cautious. In fact, when electricity was first installed in the White House, Harrison and his wife were so terrified of being electrocuted, they refused to touch the light switches. Let's rewind to 1891. The world was buzzing, literally, with the hum of new technology. Electricity was slowly replacing gas lamps in homes and public buildings. It was exciting, a little dangerous, and definitely unfamiliar. Enter the White House. During Harrison's presidency, electric lighting was introduced to the executive mansion for the very first time. It was a huge moment. The new system was installed by none other than Thomas Edison's company, and it turned the White House into one of the most modern homes in the country. On paper, anyway. But for the Harrisons, it wasn't exactly a bright idea. The couple was deeply suspicious of this newfangled electricity. At the time, electric wiring wasn't as well insulated or regulated as it is today. There were stories, some true, some exaggerated, of people being shocked just by flipping switches or touching fixtures. So Benjamin and his wife, Caroline, took no chances. Rather than risk getting zapped, they often left the lights on all night, or had White House staff operate the switches for them. Imagine walking into a room, needing the lights off, and having to find someone else to do it for you. That was life in the White House in the early 1890s. But let's be fair, Harrison wasn't anti-progress. In fact, he supported modernizing the government in many ways. His administration introduced a steel navy, pushed for better weather forecasting, and signed into law the Sherman Antitrust Act. which would go on to play a major role in regulating big business. He was also the first president to have his voice recorded on a phonograph, another Edison invention. So while he may have been cautious with electricity, he wasn't stuck in the past. Still, the image of the President of the United States afraid to flip a light switch, it's priceless. It reminds us that even the most powerful people in the world are still human, awkward, hesitant, and sometimes hilariously unprepared for the future. Benjamin Harrison's term only lasted 4 years, and he lost his re-election bid to none other than Grover Cleveland, who returned for a second non-consecutive term. So, while Harrison didn't leave behind the biggest political legacy, he did shine, pun intended, as the man who brought electricity to the White House, but never quite trusted the power in his own walls. William McKinley, the president who gave away his good luck charm. Some people carry rabbit's feet. Others avoid walking under ladders. But William McKinley, the 25th president of the United States, believed in the simple power of a red carnation. He wore one almost every day. Pinned to his lapel, the red flower became his signature look, and, according to him, his good luck charm. But on September 6, 1901, during a public event in Buffalo, New York, McKinley did something he'd done countless times before. He smiled, shook hands with supporters, and graciously handed his red carnation to a young girl in the crowd. Moments later, he was shot twice in the abdomen by an assassin posing as another admirer in line. The man who fired the shots was Leon Czolgosz, an anarchist who claimed he was inspired by radical anti-government beliefs. The shooting took place inside the Temple of Music at the Pan American Exposition, where McKinley had gone to greet the public. At first, things didn't seem too bad. McKinley even told his staff, "Be careful how you tell my wife." And doctors believed he might recover. But over the next several days, his condition worsened. An infection spread, likely because the doctors never located one of the bullets, and antiseptic practices at the time were still primitive. On September 14th, 1901, just over a week after being shot, McKinley died. Now people couldn't help but fixate on the timing. He had worn that lucky carnation every day, until the moment he gave it away. Was it just a coincidence? Or something eerily poetic? Either way, the story stuck. The red carnation became a symbol of both McKinley's kindness and his tragic end. For years after, McKinley Day was celebrated in Ohio, with people wearing red carnations in his memory. But here's the twist. McKinley wasn't a superstitious man overall. He was rational, calm, and deeply methodical. But the red carnation? That was his one visible quirk, his soft spot for symbolism and sentiment. It's a heartbreaking detail in the life of a man who had led the U.S. through the Spanish-American War, annexed territories like Hawaii and Puerto Rico, and helped guide America into the 20th century as a global power. His death also elevated Vice President Theodore Roosevelt to the presidency, and that changed American politics forever. So whether it was fate, coincidence, or just a tragic fluke, the moment McKinley handed off his lucky flower was the last peaceful gesture of a kind, composed leader who believed in connecting with the people. Coming up next, the man who took over after McKinley's assassination, a cowboy, soldier, author, hunter, and once blinded boxer who kept it a secret from the press. Let's meet the unforgettable Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, the president who took a punch, lost an eye, and told no one. Theodore Roosevelt was many things: soldier, scholar, cowboy, naturalist, and president. But here's one title you probably didn't know he held: secretly one-eyed boxer. Yes, while serving as president of the United States, Roosevelt was blinded in one eye during a boxing match at the White House, and he kept it a secret from almost everyone. Let's rewind. Roosevelt, the 26th president, was known for his boundless energy and love of physical activity. He called it the strenuous life, and he lived it to the max. Hiking, riding, hunting, wrestling, anything physical, Roosevelt was all in, and boxing, that was one of his favorites. Even as president, Roosevelt would spar regularly with military officers, friends, and even professional fighters. He had a boxing ring set up inside the White House, and he loved challenging younger, stronger opponents just to stay sharp. But then came the punch. During one of these private bouts, A young artillery officer landed a hard shot to Roosevelt's face. No fanfare, no drama, just a perfectly placed punch, right in the eye. At first, Roosevelt didn't think much of it. He was used to scrapes and bruises. But over the next few days, his vision began to blur. Eventually, he lost the sight in his left eye, permanently. Now here's the crazy part. He didn't tell the public. He didn't even blame the young officer. He quietly stopped boxing and took up jiu-jitsu instead. Yep, because if he couldn't spar with fists, he'd grapple with throws and locks instead. Years later, in a letter, Roosevelt casually mentioned the injury. I was playing boxing with a captain, and he crossed me one just on the point of the eye, and the blow smashed the little blood vessels. Accordingly, I now cannot see out of my left eye. Just imagine that today, a sitting US president getting blinded during a White House sparring match and not turning it into a media circus. But for Roosevelt, that was the norm. He wasn't trying to look tough, he was tough. This was the same man who gave a campaign speech after being shot in the chest, with the bullet still inside him, and told the crowd, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose." So losing sight in one eye? Just another chapter in the wild adventure that was Theodore Roosevelt's life. He remains one of the most rugged, fearless, and larger-than-life figures ever to occupy the Oval Office. A president who didn't just talk about strength and courage, he lived it every day, right down to the final round. Next up, a president who was so large, he allegedly got stuck in the White House bathtub and had to have a custom one built just for him. Let's wade into the unforgettable story of William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft, the president who got stuck in a bathtub. Of all the presidential legends, there's one that always seems to bubble to the surface, pun very much intended. William Howard Taft, the 27th president of the United States, is most famously remembered for allegedly getting stuck in the White House bathtub. Now, did it really happen? Well, maybe. But either way, the story's too good not to share. Let's get into it. Taft was a big man, very big. He weighed somewhere between 300 and 340 pounds during his presidency, making him the heaviest president in U.S. history. At 5'11", he was solidly built and carried his weight evenly, but there was no denying that he was, by any standard, a large man. According to the most popular version of the story, Taft tried to take a relaxing soak in the White House bathtub and got stuck. Not metaphorically, physically. The story goes that it took multiple staff members, sometimes said to be 4 or 6, to help pull him out. It's one of those tales that's become American folklore. But here's the catch. There's no concrete record that it actually happened. No diary entry, no newspaper article from the time, just word-of-mouth reports that snowballed into presidential legend. However, what is documented is this. After Taft became president, a custom-built bathtub was installed in the White House. It was massive, nearly 7 feet long, over 3 feet wide, and capable of holding 4 grown men, a fact proudly photographed by the manufacturer. It was installed shortly after his 1909 inauguration, so even if the stuck in the tub incident never occurred, it's clear that the White House staff wasn't taking any chances. Taft, for his part, had a good sense of humor about his size. He was well aware of the jokes and even cracked a few himself, but behind the self-deprecating humor was a brilliant legal mind. He didn't want to be president. He actually wanted to be a judge. And after his presidency, he finally got his dream job. In 1921, Taft became Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, the only person in history to serve as both President and Chief Justice. And according to many, he was much happier on the bench than behind the desk in the Oval Office. So yes, the bathtub story might be exaggerated, but the man was larger than life, in stature, in legacy, and in the tub. Next up, a president whose wife secretly ran the country for over a year after he suffered a devastating stroke. Let's talk about Woodrow Wilson and the unofficial first female president of the United States. Woodrow Wilson, the president whose wife may have secretly taken over. Imagine this. The president of the United States suffers a massive stroke, and the country doesn't find out the full truth for months. No press conferences, no official transfer of power, just the First Lady quietly taking the reins behind the scenes. That's the incredible story of Woodrow Wilson, and how his wife, Edith Wilson, may have been America's first female president in everything but name. Let's rewind to 1919. Wilson, the 28th president, had just returned from Europe after negotiating the Treaty of Versailles, trying to bring the U.S. into the newly formed League of Nations. He was exhausted, physically and mentally drained, but still pushing hard to get the treaty ratified by Congress. Then it happened. In October 1919, Wilson suffered a major stroke. It left him partially paralyzed, barely able to speak, and certainly unfit to govern. But here's the wild part. His condition was kept secret from the public, and even from many members of his own cabinet. The man running the most powerful country in the world, effectively out of commission. Enter Edith Wilson. Rather than invoke any formal process of presidential succession, which at the time was poorly defined, Edith stepped in. She claimed she wasn't making decisions herself, but was simply acting as a steward for her husband. But in reality, she was screening all documents, controlling access to the president, deciding which matters were important enough to bring to his attention, and communicating with government officials on his behalf. For nearly a year and a half, Edith Wilson functionally managed the executive branch. She dictated who could see the president and even wrote margin notes on memos, supposedly conveying his decisions, but no one really knows how much Wilson was truly involved. Some historians believe she wielded enormous influence over policy during that time. Others argue she was just trying to protect her husband and keep the country stable. Either way, it was unprecedented, and it sparked an intense debate over presidential disability and transparency, one that wouldn't be formally addressed until the 25th Amendment was passed decades later in 1967. Edith later wrote in her memoir, "I never made a single decision regarding the disposition of public affairs. The only decision that was mine was what was important and what was not, and the very important decision of when to present matters to my husband," which honestly sounds a lot like decision-making. So, while Woodrow Wilson's name is the one in the history books for nearly the final 17 months of his presidency, it may have been Edith Wilson quietly calling the shots. Next up, a president with a serious poker habit, who once gambled away an entire set of White House china. Let's shuffle the deck with Warren G. Harding. Warren G. Harding, the president who bet the dishes and lost. Warren G. Harding wasn't just the 29th president of the United States. He was also a man who really loved to gamble. Cards, booze, women, you name it. If it was risky, Harding probably dabbled in it. But perhaps the most bizarre entry in his long list of presidential scandals? He allegedly gambled away an entire set of White House china. Let's unpack that. Harding took office in 1921, bringing with him a group of close friends and political allies he affectionately called the Ohio Gang. These guys weren't exactly model public servants. They drank bootleg liquor during Prohibition, played poker late into the night, and were involved in multiple shady deals. Harding himself, a devoted poker player, he loved hosting card games in the White House, often in the Red Room, complete with cigars, whiskey, and high-stakes pots. Now, somewhere in the haze of one of these all-night poker sessions, Harding, according to several sources, got a little too into the game and put up a set of White House china as his bet, and he lost. Yes, the official dishes of the executive mansion, those fancy plates used to serve dignitaries and foreign leaders, reportedly changed hands over a bluff or a bad hand. Can you imagine showing up to a state dinner and realizing you're eating off a president's poker loss? Now, is this story 100% confirmed? Like many great tales from history, it's a little blurry around the edges. Some historians treat it as legend. Others point to eyewitness accounts that suggest it's more fact than fiction. Either way, it fits Harding's larger-than-life, risk-loving personality to a T. And let's be real. Even if the exact details are fuzzy, the guy's administration was so full of scandal, it's totally believable. Take, for example, the infamous Teapot Dome scandal, where his Secretary of the Interior secretly leased government oil reserves to private companies in exchange for massive bribes. Or the constant rumors of affairs, including one with a woman who later claimed he fathered her child, confirmed by DNA testing decades later. Harding once said, "I am not fit for this office and should never have been here." And, well, the evidence kind of backs that up. But despite the chaos, Harding was widely liked at the time. He was charismatic, relaxed, and promised a return to normalcy after World War I, a phrase he coined that we still use today. Still, gambling away presidential dinnerware might be the most on-brand story for a guy who ran the White House like a casino lounge. Coming up next, A president so quiet, he used to press the emergency buzzer just to mess with the Secret Service. Let's meet the hilariously deadpan Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge, the president who pranked the Secret Service. If you had to pick one president to star in a political comedy without ever cracking a smile, it would be Calvin Coolidge. Nicknamed Silent Cal, he was known for his dry humor, quiet demeanor, and an ability to say more with a stare than most people could with a speech. But behind the reserved expression was a man who loved a good prank, especially if it involved messing with the Secret Service. One of the most legendary stories from Coolidge's presidency involves the emergency call buzzer on his desk. Now, normally, that button would be used to summon aides or security in case of a serious issue. But Coolidge, he had a different idea. He'd press the buzzer, wait for Secret Service agents to rush into his office, full panic mode, only to look up at them calmly and say something like, "I didn't press it." No explanation, no apology, just a blank face and an awkward silence. Then he'd go back to work, leaving the agents wondering if they'd imagined the whole thing. This wasn't a one-time joke. Coolidge reportedly did it more than once, just to mess with people. And that wasn't the only time he used his dry wit to confuse the people around him. There's a famous story from a dinner party where a woman sitting next to him said, "Mr. President, I made a bet that I could get you to say more than 2 words. Coolidge looked at her, paused, and replied, "You lose." That's Calvin Coolidge in a nutshell. Despite his quiet personality, he was a surprisingly effective and popular president. He took office after the sudden death of Warren G. Harding in 1923 and helped restore trust in the presidency after Harding's scandal-ridden term. Coolidge was known for being fiscally conservative, cutting taxes, reducing the national debt, and keeping the federal government lean. His motto was basically, "Don't do more than you need to." He believed that prosperity came from hard work and individual responsibility, not from government intervention. That made him wildly popular in the booming 1920s, earning him another term in office with ease. But when the time came for the 1928 election, Coolidge shocked everyone by choosing not to run again, even though he likely would have won. Why? He simply said, "I do not choose to run for president" in 1928. And just like that, he walked away. Classic Coolidge. So while he may not have delivered soaring speeches or grand emotional moments, Calvin Coolidge quietly made his mark with silence, sarcasm, and just a hint of trolling. Coming up next, a president who spoke Mandarin Chinese with his wife, so the White House staff wouldn't understand what they were saying. Let's decode the story of Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover, the president who spoke Mandarin in the White House. When you think of presidents who could keep a secret, Herbert Hoover might not be the first name that comes to mind. But here's a fun fact that'll surprise you. Herbert Hoover and his wife, Lou, used to speak Mandarin Chinese in the White House to keep conversations private from the staff. Yes, Mandarin, in the early 20th century and in the executive mansion. It sounds like something out of a spy novel, but it's absolutely true. And it all goes back to their time living abroad. Before he was president, Hoover wasn't a politician. He was a mining engineer, and a wildly successful one at that. He traveled the world for his work, including an extended stay in China in the early 1900s. That's where he and Lou learned to speak Mandarin, partly out of necessity and partly out of curiosity. They didn't just dabble, they got pretty fluent. They even hired tutors and practiced reading and writing Chinese characters together in their spare time. By the time they returned to the US, it had become a shared skill and a secret weapon. Fast forward to the White House years. Whenever Herbert and Lou wanted to have a private conversation, especially when surrounded by aides or servants, they'd simply switch over to Mandarin. It was their built-in code language, and very few, if any, people in the White House could understand them. Whether they were discussing policy, guests, or just how bad the fish tasted at dinner, they had a perfect linguistic escape route. It might sound like overkill, but keep in mind, this was the Great Depression era. Tensions were high, politics were cutthroat, and Hoover, despite being incredibly smart and capable, was not great at public relations. Being able to communicate discreetly in his own home gave him a rare sense of control. Now, speaking Mandarin wasn't Hoover's only surprising talent. He was also an author, a humanitarian, and one of the few presidents who truly never held elected office before stepping into the White House. He made his name organizing massive food relief efforts in Europe during and after World War I. Unfortunately, when the Great Depression hit just months into his presidency, Hoover's reputation tanked. His cautious, hands-off approach to the economy didn't sit well with the American people, and by 1932, voters were ready for change. Still, behind the scenes, he remained one of the most globally experienced, linguistically gifted presidents we've ever had. So if you ever walk through the White House and imagine hushed conversations happening in the halls, just picture the Hoovers whispering in perfect Mandarin while everyone else wondered what was going on. Next up, a president who survived an assassination attempt before taking office, and the bullet hit someone standing right next to him. Let's talk about the dramatic pre-inauguration moment of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the president who survived a bullet before he was even president. Franklin D. Roosevelt, or FDR, is best known for steering the country through the Great Depression and World War II. But before he ever stepped foot into the White House, he had already narrowly escaped death in a scene that felt ripped straight from a political thriller. Let's go back to February 15th, 1933 in Miami, Florida. FDR had just won the presidential election and was preparing to take office the following month. At a public event in Bayfront Park, he was giving a speech from the back of an open-air car, surrounded by a large, enthusiastic crowd. As Roosevelt wrapped up his remarks and waved to the people, a man pushed forward through the crowd, pulled out a pistol, and fired 5 shots. The shooter, Giuseppe Zangara, an Italian immigrant and anarchist who claimed he hated government figures and blamed the wealthy for his chronic pain and struggles. FDR, he wasn't hit, not a scratch. But the bullets didn't miss everyone. Anton Chermak, the mayor of Chicago, who was standing right next to Roosevelt, was struck. Several others in the crowd were also injured. Roosevelt, rather than ducking or fleeing, immediately ordered his driver to take Chermak to the hospital, with FDR holding him in his arms the entire way. Think about that. A president-elect, moments after an assassination attempt, personally comforting a bleeding mayor in the backseat of a car. Chermak would die from his injuries about 3 weeks later. For years, rumors circulated that Zangara's real target was actually Chermak, not FDR, due to mob-related tensions in Chicago. But Zangara made it clear. He meant to kill Roosevelt. His motive? Hatred of politicians and elites. He even shouted, "I kill kings and presidents, first and next, all capitalists," during his arrest. Zangara was quickly convicted and executed just 33 days after the attack. An incredibly fast legal turnaround, even by early 20th century standards. This close call shook the nation. Had the gunman's aim been just a few inches off, American history could have changed forever. No New Deal, no 4 terms, no FDR on the dime. Roosevelt, however, seemed unfazed. The assassination attempt only added to his mystique. It reinforced his calm under pressure, his compassion, and his almost mythic aura as a leader destined for great things. And when he took office just a few weeks later, facing the worst economic crisis in American history, people didn't just see a politician. They saw a man who had literally stared death in the face and kept going. Coming up next, the man who followed him into the atomic age, and whose middle name was just a letter. Let's spell it out with Harry S. Truman. Harry S. Truman, the president with a middle name that was just S. Most people don't think twice about middle names. They're usually inherited from a relative or chosen for the way they sound. But when it comes to Harry S. Truman, the 33rd president of the United States, his middle name is a story all its own, because it's just a single letter. No name, no abbreviation, just S. Let's clear this up because it's one of the most asked trivia questions in presidential history. What does the S in Harry S. Truman stand for? Answer, nothing. Seriously, nothing. Truman was born in 1884 in Lamar, Missouri. His parents couldn't decide whether to honor his grandfather, Anderson Ship Truman, or his other grandfather, Solomon Young. So, in a true compromise move, they gave him the middle initial S to represent both grandfathers' names, without fully choosing one over the other. That's right, the S doesn't stand for Ship. It doesn't stand for Solomon. It just exists. Even the Library of Congress confirms it. There is no period after the S when writing his name, although Truman himself often signed it with a period, just to match conventional writing style. Now, you might think this is just a quirky footnote, but oh no, it's actually led to heated debates among scholars and grammar sticklers. Whole essays have been written about whether the S deserves a period or not. Imagine sparking an academic debate just by existing with a floating middle initial. That's Truman-level influence. Of course, Truman is remembered for far more than his unique name. He became president in April 1945 after Franklin D. Roosevelt died suddenly during his fourth term. Truman had only been vice president for 82 days and hadn't even been fully briefed on some of the most important matters of state. Then boom, he was thrust into office during the final stages of World War. And just months later, he made the most controversial decision in presidential history, dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He led the U.S. through the end of World War II, the beginning of the Cold War, the founding of the United Nations, and the start of the Korean War. Not bad for a guy with no college degree and a middle name that doesn't mean anything, but maybe that middle initial represents something more symbolic: strength, stubbornness, or sheer resolve. Because Truman wasn't flashy, but he was firm. He made hard calls and never backed down from a challenge. So the next time you see Harry S. Truman, just remember that S stands for exactly what he wanted it to: nothing and everything at once. Coming up next, the Supreme Commander turned president who loved golf so much he accidentally destroyed the White House lawn. Let's tee off with Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the president who loved golf and tore up the lawn. Dwight D. Eisenhower was the five-star general who led Allied forces to victory in World War II, a war hero, a national icon, a steady hand in a tense Cold War era. But once he got to the White House, all he really wanted to do was golf. Eisenhower, the 34th president, didn't just enjoy golf, he was obsessed with it. By the end of his presidency, he had played an estimated 800 rounds. That's right, 800. If you divide that over his 8 years in office, that's about 2 rounds per week, every week, for 8 straight years. And he didn't stop when he got home. In fact, Eisenhower was known to sneak out into the White House South Lawn to practice his swing. He had a putting green installed right outside the Oval Office, so he could take a break between meetings to chip and putt. But here's where it gets funny. He practiced so often and with such passion that he damaged the lawn. Seriously, patches of the White House grass had to be regularly repaired because Ike couldn't resist the urge to dig in his cleats and hit a few balls between briefings. The Secret Service even joked that they knew where to find him if he wasn't at his desk. Just follow the divots. Eisenhower also had a special golf cabin built at Camp David, and his passion for the sport influenced the culture around him. Golf wasn't just a hobby, it became part of his brand. He helped turn it into a symbol of presidential power and leisure, and it didn't stop with physical play. He even had a tree removed from the White House grounds because it interfered with his shots. No joke, that tree became known as the Eisenhower tree, and when he had it cut down, golfers across the country knew exactly why. His love for golf was so well known that Augusta National Golf Club, one of the most prestigious courses in the U.S., made him a member and even named a tree on the 17th hole after him. That tree stood for decades, until a storm finally took it down in 2014. Now, some critics thought Eisenhower's golfing habits made him look disengaged or too relaxed, but his supporters saw it differently. A president who kept a cool head, stayed grounded, and used the game as a way to clear his mind. And honestly, who can blame him? After leading a world war and running a superpower during the nuclear age, a few swings on the lawn seemed like well-deserved therapy. So yes, Eisenhower helped defeat fascism, built the interstate highway system, and managed Cold War tensions. But he also waged war on the White House grass with a 9-iron. Coming up next, a young, charismatic president who owned a pet rabbit named Zaza and won a Pulitzer Prize. Let's meet the legend, John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy, the Pulitzer-winning president with a pet rabbit named Zaza. John F. Kennedy, handsome, eloquent, forever youthful, remains one of the most iconic presidents in U.S. history. He inspired a generation, led during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and pushed America toward the moon. But behind the famous speeches and Camelot glamour, JFK had some surprisingly quirky facts of his own, like the fact that he once owned a pet rabbit named Zsa Zsa. Yes, Zsa Zsa, like the glamorous Hollywood star Zsa Zsa Gabor. And while most presidents have dogs, and sometimes even horses, JFK's rabbit was a bit of a celebrity herself. Here's how it happened. Zaza was actually a gift from a magician who performed at the White House for one of Caroline Kennedy's parties. After pulling the rabbit out of a hat, the magician offered it to the president's young daughter. Caroline accepted, but instead of handing the bunny off to the staff or tucking her away at the family's Virginia estate, the rabbit reportedly stayed close, and the press quickly caught wind of the name. So it was a small, silly story, but one that perfectly captured the charm and youthful energy that surrounded the Kennedy White House. But while JFK had a soft spot for rabbits, he also had a serious intellectual side, one that earned him a Pulitzer Prize, making him the only U.S. president to ever receive one. He won the Pulitzer for his book Profiles in Courage, published in 1956. The book is a collection of biographical sketches of U.S. senators who, throughout history, stood up for principle even when it meant political risk. The writing is elegant and thoughtful, and it quickly became a bestseller. Some debate has lingered over how much of the writing JFK did himself. His speechwriter Ted Sorensen reportedly contributed significantly, but Kennedy received the Pulitzer for biography or autobiography in 1957, and it wasn't just an award for decoration. The book's message of political bravery became central to Kennedy's personal brand. He often referenced it during his presidency, encouraging Americans to embrace service, sacrifice, and moral courage. So, while JFK might be known for "ask not what your country can do for you," moon missions, and Cold War diplomacy, let's not forget he was also a Pulitzer-winning author who let his daughter keep a magician's rabbit named Zaza, a combination of intellect, elegance, and just the right amount of whimsy, which pretty much sums up the Kennedy presidency. Next up, the tall Texan with a love of power showers, flashy gestures, and a habit of holding staff meetings while sitting on the toilet. Let's get up close and personal with Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson, the president who took power, even into the bathroom. Lyndon B. Johnson, the towering Texan who took over after JFK's assassination, is known for some of the most sweeping reforms in American history: civil rights, Medicare, the Great Society. But behind the legislative legacy was a man of, let's say, unfiltered personality. In fact, LBJ might go down in history as the most personally bizarre president, and one of the strangest things he was known for, holding staff meetings while sitting on the toilet. No, really. If you were part of Johnson's inner circle, press secretary, aide, or advisor, there was always a chance you'd be called in to brief the President of the United States while he was mid-bowel movement. Door open, pants down, no shame, just full eye contact and full presidential power. To Johnson, there was nothing inappropriate about it. He believed time was precious and conversation could happen anywhere, including the restroom. If you worked for LBJ, you got used to it, or you didn't last long. This was just one part of what staffers called the LBJ treatment. It was legendary. Johnson had a way of getting what he wanted through a mix of flattery, intimidation, physical proximity, and relentless persistence. He'd invade your personal space, lean in so close you could feel his breath, poke your chest with a finger, or clasp your hand so tightly you thought you'd never get it back. He could be vulgar, charming, terrifying, and persuasive, all in the same sentence. And while we're on the subject of bathroom behavior, here's another classic LBJ move. He named his dog Little Beagle Johnson, showed reporters his post-surgery scar by lifting his shirt in public, and famously gave tours of the White House bathrooms, showing off his custom-installed power shower, complete with multi-directional jets strong enough to almost peel skin off. Johnson didn't believe in half measures. Not in policy, not in personality, and despite all his eccentricities, his accomplishments were enormous. He signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and launched massive programs to fight poverty, promote education, and expand healthcare. He took Kennedy's vision and supercharged it with political muscle, but his legacy is also haunted by the Vietnam War, which escalated dramatically under his leadership and ultimately led to public outrage and a decision not to seek re-election in 1968. So yeah, LBJ could be rough around the edges, very rough, but he wielded power like few presidents ever have. And if you ever find yourself in a meeting that feels awkward, Just remember, at least you're not being briefed while someone is on the toilet. Coming up next, a president who gave the weirdest pardon ever to a turkey that would have ended up on his Thanksgiving plate. Let's gobble up the tale of Richard Nixon. Or wait, was it actually Reagan who made it a tradition? Let's find out in Fact 37. Richard Nixon, the president, probably behind the first turkey pardon. Thanksgiving at the White House has been a tradition for over a century, but did you know that the most bizarre part of it, pardoning a live turkey, might have started with Richard Nixon? Or maybe it was John F. Kennedy? Or Ronald Reagan? Honestly, the truth is a little weird and very presidential. Let's carve into it. Every year around Thanksgiving, the President of the United States is presented with a live turkey gifted by the National Turkey Federation, and every year, that turkey receives a presidential pardon and is spared from becoming dinner. It's a charming, quirky ceremony now, but no one can agree who actually started it. Here's where Richard Nixon comes in. In the early 1970s, when Nixon was president, he accepted a turkey at the White House, but instead of sending it off to the kitchen, he sent it to a petting zoo. Reporters noticed, and that led to some lighthearted jokes that the bird had been pardoned. Nixon didn't officially say the word pardon, but the gesture was there, and given Nixon's eventual resignation, it's kind of ironic that he may have granted a pardon before needing one himself. However, some historians argue that John F. Kennedy deserves the credit. In 1963, just days before his assassination, JFK looked at the Thanksgiving turkey on the White House lawn and said, "We'll just let this one grow. It's our Thanksgiving present to him." No paperwork, no ceremony, but definitely a lucky bird. Still others say it was Ronald Reagan who brought the term pardon into play during a 1987 press conference. A reporter asked if Reagan would pardon officials involved in the Iran-Contra affair. Reagan dodged the question with a joke, saying he'd already pardoned the Thanksgiving turkey that year. That same turkey was sent to live at a children's farm, and the moment was caught on camera. Boom, presidential turkey pardon humor was born. But the first official, publicly stated turkey pardon didn't happen until 1989 under George H.W. Bush. During his first Thanksgiving as president, Bush said, "Let me assure you, this fine turkey will not end up on anyone's dinner table." He's granted a presidential pardon. From that moment on, the turkey pardon became an annual White House tradition. So, while Nixon may have unofficially started the practice and Kennedy and Reagan kept it going, it was Bush who gave it the presidential stamp of approval. Still, it's poetic that Nixon, a man whose own political downfall involved a pardon of a very different kind, might have been the first to spare a turkey. Gerald R. Ford, the president who was never elected president or vice president. Gerald R. Ford holds a unique and strange record in American history. He's the only person to become both vice president and president without ever being elected to either office. That's right. Ford never won a single national election before taking the highest office in the land. Here's how it happened. In 1973, Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned amid a tax evasion scandal. President Richard Nixon, mired in his own growing troubles, hello, Watergate, needed a replacement. Under the 25th Amendment, Nixon could appoint a new vice president, and he chose a friendly, scandal-free congressman from Michigan, Gerald Ford. Ford was widely respected, honest, and calm. A Boy Scout in a storm. The Senate confirmed him, and Ford became vice president. But less than a year later, in August 1974, Nixon resigned in disgrace. And just like that, Ford became the 38th president of the United States, without ever appearing on a presidential or vice presidential ballot. Wild, right? Ford's presidency started with a bang, specifically a full pardon of Nixon. He believed the country needed to move on from Watergate, but the decision crushed his popularity. Many saw it as a backroom deal. Still, Ford remained a humble leader. Fun fact, he was a former college football star at the University of Michigan and turned down offers to play in the NFL. He was also incredibly clumsy, and the media had a field day with footage of him tripping on stairs and bumping his head. Ford laughed it off, but behind the bloopers was a man who helped steady the country in a moment of crisis. Jimmy Carter, the president who filed a UFO sighting report. Jimmy Carter, America's 39th president, may be the most wholesome guy to ever hold the office. Peanut farmer, Sunday school teacher, Habitat for Humanity volunteer. But did you know he also saw a UFO? Yep. Carter filed an official report in 1973 claiming that in 1969, He and about 10 other people saw a bright white object in the sky that hovered, changed colors, and then vanished. He was so convinced it was unexplained, he promised during his campaign to make government UFO files public. Spoiler, he later backed off that promise for national security reasons. The object was never confirmed to be alien. But Carter never retracted his story either. Oh, and he's also a nuclear physicist, speaks Spanish, and once fended off a swimming rabbit that tried to jump in his boat. Yes, that really happened. Coming up next, a former Hollywood actor turned world leader who once received dozens of jelly beans every month as part of his presidential diet. Ronald Reagan, the president powered by jelly beans. When you picture Ronald Reagan, you might see a commanding voice, a sharp suit, and a legacy tied to the Cold War, economic policy, and conservative politics. But here's a fact that's downright sweet. Ronald Reagan loved jelly beans. Not just liked. Loved. To the point that he had them shipped to the White House by the case. Let's rewind. Before Reagan became the 40th president, he was governor of California in the late 1960s and early 70s. Around that time, he made a decision to quit smoking, which, for anyone trying to kick the habit, is no easy task. So instead of reaching for a cigarette, Reagan reached for candy, specifically jelly beans. At first, he munched on a brand called Goelitz Mini Jelly Beans, which would later become Jelly Belly, and he got hooked. In fact, he liked them so much, his team started ordering tens of thousands of them for his office. By the time Reagan became president in 1981, jelly beans had become his thing. They were everywhere, in his meetings, on Air Force One, in the Situation Room, and even in congressional briefings. He believed they helped lighten the mood and even aided in focus. He once said, "You can tell a lot about a fellow's character by whether he picks out all of one color or just grabs a handful." And speaking of colors, when he was inaugurated, Goelitz, aka Jelly Belly, created a custom red, white, and blue mix just for the occasion. Reagan's administration ordered an estimated 3.5 tons of jelly beans per year. And yes, the company had to design a special airtight jar for the White House so they could be neatly poured without spilling all over presidential paperwork. One of the most iconic jelly bean moments, during a 1983 meeting with British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, a large crystal jar of jelly beans sat between them on the table, world leaders discussing nuclear strategy, while casually reaching for candy. Reagan's obsession with jelly beans became such a phenomenon that Jelly Belly saw its sales skyrocket, and the company even sent beans into space aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger in 1983 as a nod to Reagan's love for the treat. So, while Ronald Reagan is remembered for taking down the Berlin Wall, revitalizing the American economy, and redefining the conservative movement, he also left behind a delicious, chewy, slightly odd legacy: the Jelly Bean President. George H.W. Bush, the president who skydived on his 90th birthday. George H.W. Bush, the 41st president, was known for his calm diplomacy and careful leadership during the end of the Cold War. But what many people don't realize is he was a thrill seeker. In fact, Bush celebrated his 90th birthday by jumping out of a plane. Yes, skydiving at 90. It wasn't his first time either. He had done it at 75, 80, and 85. His final jump in 2014 was tandem style, and he landed in a field near his home in Kennebunkport, Maine, waving from his wheelchair full of joy. This wasn't just a stunt. Bush had been a Navy pilot during World War II and had been shot down over the Pacific. He bailed out of his plane at age 20, barely surviving. That first jump shaped his life, and he kept skydiving as a way to mark milestones and honor his survival. Despite his genteel, grandfatherly image, George H.W. Bush was a man of quiet grit and adventure. Next up, a leader who played the saxophone on late-night TV and had a cat named Socks who had his own press photos. Let's swing into the smooth and scandalous world of Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, the president who blew the sax and made his cat a star. Bill Clinton, the 42nd president, was known for his charisma, his communication skills, and his saxophone solos. That's right. Long before he was in the Oval Office, Clinton was on stage, jamming on the sax, and once he hit the campaign trail in the early 90s, he brought that smooth jazz energy with him. One of the most iconic pop culture moments in presidential history happened in June 1992 when then-candidate Clinton appeared on the Arsenio Hall show. Wearing sunglasses, a black suit, and holding his tenor saxophone, Clinton stepped on stage and played Heartbreak Hotel. Yes, the Elvis Presley classic with Arsenio's house band. The crowd went wild. And just like that, Clinton proved he wasn't your average politician. He was a cool, relatable, musically gifted guy who could connect with younger voters on a cultural level. That single performance is credited with boosting his popularity, especially among Gen Xers and first-time voters. He wasn't stiff, formal, or boring. He was jamming on late-night TV, and that mattered. But Clinton wasn't the only Clinton with a flair for the spotlight. Enter Socks the cat, a black and white tuxedo cat who became an unexpected media icon during the Clinton years. Socks originally belonged to the Clintons' daughter, Chelsea, and was adopted before they even moved into the White House. Once the family settled in, Socks became the first cat, with his own fan mail, photo shoots, and even a video game. Yes, in 1996, Socks the Cat Rocks the Hill was developed for the Super Nintendo. It featured Socks fighting through Washington, D.C. to stop foreign spies and political villains. The game was never officially released at the time, but it became a cult legend among retro gamers and was finally published years later by fans. Socks also had his own children's book, Dear Socks, Dear Buddy, which featured letters kids wrote to the first pets. And for a while, Socks had a higher approval rating than most politicians. But behind all the sax solos and adorable animals, Clinton's presidency was a roller coaster. He presided over a booming economy, passed major welfare reform, and left office with high approval ratings. But he also faced one of the biggest political scandals in U.S. history, his affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky, which led to impeachment proceedings in 1998. Still, Clinton was acquitted and served out his term, remaining a defining figure in the 1990s American politics. So yes, he played the sax. His cat had a fan base, and for better or worse, Bill Clinton knew how to put on a show. Next up, a president who choked on a pretzel, briefly lost consciousness, and still made jokes about it afterward. Let's catch up with George W. Bush. George W. Bush, the president taken down by a pretzel. You'd expect the president of the United States to face threats from global crises, political opposition, or international diplomacy. But for George W. Bush, one of his scariest moments in office came from a pretzel. Yep, a snack. On January 13th, 2002, Bush was relaxing in the White House residence, watching an NFL playoff game between the Miami Dolphins and the Baltimore Ravens. Just a typical Sunday. The president was alone, watching TV and munching on a handful of pretzels. Then it happened. According to Bush himself, he choked on a pretzel, passed out briefly, and fell off the couch, banging his head in the process. When he came to, he noticed he had a small bruise and scrape on his face, and he immediately called for the White House physician, who confirmed he was okay. The official explanation? His vagus nerve had been stimulated when he choked, triggering a brief fainting spell, harmless in the long term, but still terrifying in the moment. Now, you might think the White House would try to play this down, but Bush? He leaned into the humor. The very next day, he stood in front of reporters with a bruise on his cheek and a self-deprecating grin saying, "I hit the deck. I told my mother I wasn't going to eat any more pretzels." And just like that, what could have been a PR disaster turned into late-night comedy gold and a moment of relatability for a president often seen as rigid or overly rehearsed. The pretzel incident became a symbol of Bush's unexpected mix of folksy charm and unexpected vulnerability. It reminded people that even the leader of the free world can have a bad snack experience on the couch. But make no mistake, Bush's presidency was far from laid back. Just 4 months before the pretzel episode, the country had suffered the September attacks, and Bush was suddenly thrust into a wartime presidency. He led the U.S. into wars in Afghanistan and later Iraq, reshaping American foreign policy and triggering years of national debate. He also oversaw the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, signed the Patriot Act, and dealt with crises like Hurricane Katrina and the 2008 financial crash during his final year in office. But through it all, Bush remained surprisingly open about his gaffes, quirks, and missteps. From mispronouncing nuclear to tripping on camera, he became as famous for his awkward moments as his policies. And somehow that humanized him. So yes, George W. Bush faced terror threats, wars, and economic collapse, but he also got knocked out by a pretzel. Coming up next, a president whose campaign was so digital savvy, it revolutionized politics, and who once publicly shared his March Madness bracket on ESPN. Let's log in with Barack Obama. Barack Obama, the president who took March Madness to the White House. By the time Barack Obama entered the White House in 2009, the world had already changed. Social media, smartphones, and 24/7 cable news had transformed how politicians connected with the public. But Obama, he didn't just adapt to the digital age, he thrived in it. And one of his most unexpected yet wildly popular presidential traditions, filling out a March Madness bracket on live TV. Yep, every year of his presidency, Obama sat down with ESPN to reveal his NCAA basketball tournament predictions, a segment playfully dubbed Barackatology. It started in 2009, just a couple of months after taking office. Obama, a huge basketball fan and former high school player, appeared on SportsCenter with a whiteboard and a marker. Wearing a crisp suit and his signature cool, he walked through his picks for the men's college basketball tournament. He explained each choice like a seasoned analyst, giving shout-outs to underdogs and basketball legends alike, and people loved it. It instantly humanized him. He wasn't just a global leader. He was a guy who got excited about buzzer beaters and upsets just like everyone else. The tradition continued every year he was in office. In later years, he even did a women's bracket, further boosting visibility for women's college basketball. And the impact? Huge. Millions tuned in each year. Sports fans who didn't care about politics suddenly saw the president as someone relatable. Bracket culture became presidential culture, and Obama's picks even influenced betting trends and office pools around the country. Even cooler, he wasn't bad at it. In 2009, his very first bracket correctly predicted the champion, the North Carolina Tar Heels. He didn't always nail it after that. Hey, who does? But he always brought thoughtful commentary and a bit of fun to a tense and often divided political atmosphere. But the Barackatology phenomenon wasn't just about basketball. It was about changing how presidents connect with people. Obama understood that in the modern media world, leaders needed to show more than policy and power. They had to show personality. He appeared on YouTube, podcasts, late-night shows, and even Between Two Ferns with Zach Galifianakis. But the March Madness brackets were a yearly reminder that even the commander-in-chief can get emotionally invested in a Cinderella story. After leaving office, Obama kept the tradition going. He still fills out brackets and shares them publicly, proving it was never just a stunt. It was who he is. So, while Barack Obama will be remembered for healthcare reform, foreign policy, and his soaring speeches, don't forget, he was also the president who turned college hoops into presidential tradition. Coming up next, a president who once hosted a reality TV show, tweeted like no one before him, and brought a whole new definition to the phrase unconventional leader. Let's step into the spectacle of Donald Trump. Donald Trump, the reality TV star who became president. Say what you will about Donald J. Trump, but one thing's for sure. He made history in his own way. Before becoming the 45th president of the United States, Trump was already a household name, not for political policy, military service, or community organizing, but for being a real estate mogul and TV personality. He's the only U.S. president who previously hosted a reality TV show. That show, The Apprentice. Premiering in 2004, The Apprentice featured Trump as the sharp-tongued CEO who put contestants through business-themed challenges. Each week, someone was dramatically fired with his signature phrase, "You're fired." It was peak 2000s TV, flashy, dramatic, and oddly addictive. The show made Trump a pop culture icon, revitalizing his brand and introducing him to millions of Americans who didn't know or care about his business background. He played the role of the powerful executive so convincingly that, for many, the lines between persona and reality began to blur. Fast forward to 2015, when Trump descended that famous golden escalator in Trump Tower to announce his candidacy for president. Pundits and politicians laughed at first, but Trump wasn't following the political playbook. He didn't need it. He had celebrity, name recognition, and perhaps most importantly, he had social media. Trump's use of Twitter completely rewrote the rules of presidential communication. Previous presidents used formal statements, polished speeches and tightly controlled press briefings. Trump used 280 characters, often in all caps, usually before 8 a.m. Whether it was policy, personal attacks, world affairs, or TV ratings, he tweeted it all. And while controversial, it kept him constantly in the news and deeply connected to his base. He ran as a political outsider, promised to drain the swamp, and won the 2016 election in one of the most shocking upsets in modern history, defeating Hillary Clinton and securing the Electoral College despite losing the popular vote. His presidency was unlike any before. He appointed 3 Supreme Court justices, passed a major tax reform bill, and dramatically altered U.S. immigration and trade policy. He also became the first president to meet with North Korea's leader, and the only one to be impeached twice. Supporters hailed him as a truth-teller who broke through establishment nonsense. Critics saw him as reckless and divisive. But one thing's undeniable. Trump blurred the lines between politics, entertainment, and branding like no one else. He made the presidency feel like a constant broadcast, and even after leaving office, he remains one of the most talked about figures in American history. From "You're fired" to "Make America Great Again," Trump took reality TV energy and brought it to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Coming up next, a president who shattered barriers as the oldest man elected and who rides Amtrak like it's a second home. Let's wrap things up with Joe Biden. Joe Biden, the president who rode Amtrak. So often, they named a station after him. Joe Biden, the 46th president of the United States, holds many historic titles. Former vice president, longtime senator, and most notably, the oldest person ever elected to the presidency. But among all those political milestones, there's one title he wears just as proudly: Amtrak Joe. That's right. While other politicians were flying private or being chauffeured around D.C., Joe Biden was commuting by train like a regular 9-to-5er. In fact, he was such a devoted rider that Amtrak named a station after him. Let's rewind to Biden's early Senate years. In 1972, just weeks after being elected to the U.S. Senate, tragedy struck. His wife and infant daughter were killed in a car accident. His 2 young sons, Beau and Hunter, were injured but survived. Heartbroken, Biden almost gave up his Senate seat, but he decided to stay in office on one condition. He would commute every day from his home in Wilmington, Delaware to Washington, D.C., so he could be with his sons every night. That meant a 2-hour train ride, round trip, every single day. For the next 36 years, Biden rode Amtrak more than 8,000 times, racking up an estimated 2 million miles. Conductors knew him by name. He'd shake hands, tell stories, and sometimes even help out with passengers. It wasn't a photo op, it was just how he lived. He even told Amtrak employees, "You're like family. You've been with me through the darkest and brightest moments of my life." In 2011, to honor his loyalty, Amtrak officially renamed the Wilmington station the Joseph R. Biden Jr. Railroad Station, a rare honor for someone still living, let alone still in politics. But Biden's Amtrak fandom is more than sentimental. As president, he's pushed for major investments in rail infrastructure, calling it essential for climate goals, job creation, and modern transportation. And yes, he still talks about the train life whenever he gets the chance. Of course, Biden's presidency is also defined by historic firsts and major challenges. He took office in the middle of a pandemic, passed the American Rescue Plan, signed a massive infrastructure bill, and led U.S. support for Ukraine after Russia's 2022 invasion. And through it all, he's maintained a style that's uniquely his own, empathetic, long-winded, and sometimes gaffe-prone, but deeply rooted in decades of experience and an everyman persona that traces back to those quiet train rides home. So yes, Joe Biden may be the oldest president ever elected, but he's also the most likely to tell you a heartfelt story about a conductor named Tommy, a cold coffee in a styrofoam cup, and a window seat on the 630 back to Wilmington. That's Amtrak Joe, a president powered by rail and resilience.